I'm Rodri Wigley and I'm lead ranger for the National Trust in Meirionnydd. Cregennan Lakes here is one of the properties that I manage. Cadair Idris is just in front of us here, and the Mawddach estuary and Barmouth and Cardingham Bay is just beyond the mountains over there. The Cregennan estate here was given to the National Trust in 1959 by Major Charles Llewellyn Wyn Jones in memory of his two sons that were killed during the Second World War. The conifers on the island were planted in memory of his two sons. The land surrounding the lake, I think, is really atmospheric. There's a huge amount of history here, from old sheepfolds, mine adits and Bronze Age standing stones. As for these lakes, I think they are the best in Wales.
I'm Dr. Tristan Hatton-Ellis, Senior Freshwater Ecologist at Natural Resources Wales. We surveyed Cregennan in 2013 and looked at several different measures of environmental quality. We looked at the water quality, we looked at the plant community, and finally we looked at the paleolimnology, which is where we take a sample of the mud at the bottom of the lake and we try and understand the environmental history of the lake based on that. There's three main concerns that we have when we look at the water quality of a lake. Those are the nutrient concentrations, the acidity, and which is related to the nutrients is the dissolved oxygen. If you have high nutrient levels, which can be caused by things like sewage pollution, or sometimes there's runoff from agriculture, those can cause problems because they cause things like algal blooms, and in turn that causes low dissolved oxygen. This is a sort of model of what a lake looks like in the summertime. So you can see that this bottom section of the lake here is quite separated out from the top layer, which is the oil in this case. And that's really what happens in real life, because water that is cold is denser than water that is warm, and so the water that is cold sinks down to the bottom and then it kind of gets stuck there. The water at the top has access to the air and also to the sort of summer breezes that we get, and so that is being oxygenated the whole time. But the water that's at the bottom of the lake doesn't have any access to any fresh oxygen until you get a really good bout of wind. So if you have nutrient problems in the lake, if there are a lot of bacteria and a lot of organic matter which is dropping into here, then this bit of the lake can get deoxygenated. Cregennan is well oxygenated for two reasons. One is that there's very low nutrient levels in the upper water column, and that means that the amount of organic matter that's coming down into this lower area is actually very small, and so it stays very high oxygen levels in this bottom layer. And the other reason is very windy, and that means that the lake is being oxygenated the whole time, and so you get this constant turning over. So it's not just in winter that it gets oxygenated. So how on earth do you go about working out the environmental history of a lake? Well, the answer, believe it or not, lies in the mud at the bottom. And the way we go about looking at this is we will collect very carefully a core from the bottom of the mud. So we plunge a core vertically down into the mud and then very carefully lift it out so you keep it all in one place. And take that back to the lab and take slices of it. Now if you think about it, the top of the mud has been deposited only recently. It's the sort of remains of bits and bobs that are from the lake that have been deposited over the last year or two, whereas what's further down the core is something that was deposited hundreds or maybe even thousands of years ago. Preserved in that mud are subfossil remains, so they're little bits and pieces of all sorts of the animals and plants that lived in the lake all that time ago. And some of the best things for looking at are tiny single-celled algae called diatoms. These are actually very beautiful little things, and they leave behind little silica skeletons that you can use to identify them. Now, the different diatom species have different environmental preferences. Some of them like acid water, some of them like alkaline water, some of them like lots of nutrients, some of them like low nutrients. And so using that information, we can look at the whole diatom community and work out what the conditions were like in the lake some time ago. But how do we know when it happened? Well, fortunately for us, and less fortunately for the environment, we can use what are called radionuclides, which are basically radioactive chemicals. Obviously there have been various nuclear accidents over time, and in particular Chernobyl is very useful, and then during the 50s and 60s there was quite a long period of nuclear testing when all sorts of countries were blowing up atom bombs and sending plumes of radioactive material into the atmosphere. And some of that radioactive material ended up in the Welsh environment, including in our lakes. And if you look at the sediment in those lakes, you can see little spikes in the sediment which provide us with those dates, so we can know that a certain spike will be the mid-80s and one a bit lower down will be the 50s and 60s. All of that radioactive material provides us with our clock, if you like. It allows us to work out at what point in time certain things happened. What we found from Cregennan is, using the diatoms, we can see that really very little has changed over the entire history of that core. And we also found out that the spikes, the spikes in the radionucleotides happened right near the top of the core, which was a real surprise to us, because what it means is that there is a very slow deposition rate of silt within the lake. So there's very, very, very slow siltation, and that means that actually the core that we took probably went back 300 or 400 years, which is quite unusual. Many cores in much more productive lakes maybe only go back 30 or 40 years, and even in Welsh upland lakes we can only be looking maybe at 150, 200 years. So basically there's a huge continuity here. This site is pristine and it hasn't changed. Well, the third thing we looked at is the plant life, and in many ways that's yielded some of the most amazing secrets of Cregennan. And if you just come with me, we'll take a look at that now. Okay, so here we are on the shoreline of the lake, and it doesn't look a very attractive habitat for plants at all. You can see that you've got this very loose, cobbly and bouldery material here, which makes it very difficult for plants to get root. And part of the reason for that, I think, is because this lake is quite exposed, and certainly when you get the strong winds coming washing in over the lake, then a lot of the fine sediment gets winnowed out of there, and so it makes it very difficult for plants to stay rooted, and also for them to basically have anything to grow in. If we look into the lake here, we can see actually that there are, after all, a few plants growing, tantalisingly out of reach. And we had a dive team go in and look at these in a little bit more detail. Now, the first thing that you can see is a zone of shoreweed and water lobelia, which grows in the slightly shallower zone just below where the worst of the wave wash occurs. And then very slowly that starts to get overtaken by great big lawns of quillwort, Isoetes lacustris, and that is really completely dominant out over much of the lake over in this direction here. Quite an interesting plant that we can see in these sections is bladderwort utricularia. This is actually a carnivorous plant. The nutrient levels in this lake are really low, and one way that this bladderwort gets around it is it has these tiny bladders which are triggered by little hairs, and when something very small like a water flea swims past, it triggers a little trapdoor to open in the bladder, and it sucks the water flea in, and the plant supplements the meagre nutrients that it gets from the water column in that way. So far what I've described is something that you could see in pretty much every upland lake in Wales and indeed in Britain. These kind of transition through to quillwort, and normally what happens below the quillwort is that there's not enough light for plants to grow, and so there's nothing else. But here it's different, and this is where it really starts to get exciting. What we see below the quillwort are these large beds of these translucent broad-leaved pondweeds. There are 3 of these species in Cregennan. There is perfoliate pondweed, which is quite a common species, but is hardly ever found in the uplands. It's normally found in lowland rivers and lowland lakes, and usually in sort of little scraggy bits. In Cregennan there's probably the largest extent of it anywhere in Wales. Then we have the long-stalked pondweed, possibly eaten prolongus. This is a beautiful thing with a whitish, slightly zigzagging stem and very dark green leaves, and it remains winter green. And it's quite a rare plant. It needs deep, clear water, and it's only found in 3 locations in Wales, and it's quite threatened in the other 2. The other one there is various leaf pondweed, which is another plant. It's not very rare, but it's not common either, and it tends to be associated with really special places. If you find it, it's a bit like a butterfly orchid or something. You know you've come to somewhere nice. As we go a little bit deeper into the lake, we get into areas where the light is really getting fairly dim now, and so even the pondweeds with their stems that go upward can't get high enough to get enough light, and so these areas are dominated by stoneworts. Stoneworts are sort of like good algae. They're rather complex algae. They occur in areas with high water quality. Initially, there's actually 4 different kinds of stoneworts in the lake, but 2 of them are sort of scattered throughout and aren't very common. One of them, though, Cara virgata, which is the one you can see here, forms these very, very dense beds, and you can see between probably about 5 and 8 meters, this is the thing that dominates the environment. Now we're getting into the really deep water, and it's sort of twilight here. It's very gloomy, and you can see that there are very few plants at all. There's only one type of plant, in fact, which is the translucent stonewort, Nitella translucens. This can cope with very low light levels, but it doesn't really like too much wind action, so it needs to be in this sort of deep water. It will grow in the shelter of other plants as well. And then finally it gets too dark even for the Nitella, and sort of below about 8.5 meters or so there's no plants at all. One of the things that really makes Cregennan so special is the depth of water to which these plants grow, which reflects the amount of light that's getting down. I don't know of any other lakes in Britain where there are plants growing to 8 meters of depth, and that, allied with the number of special plants that we're finding growing in these lakes, is what makes Cregennan so fantastic.
So Tristan's already explained to us why these lakes are so good, and we're very lucky really that the National Trust has 2 very good tenants that are managing and farming the land in a very sympathetic manner, similar to how generations before them have farmed. So there's very little chance of pollution and nutrients entering the lake.